Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And this is the topic 2 of your unit 3. We will learn about free trade and protection. However, for today's lesson, we will just focus on free trade. Well, for the first part of topic 2, we will focus on free trade. Basically, we will look into significance of trade for Australian economy, the concept of comparative advantage, and lastly, we will look into the methods or the ways how to demonstrate gains from trade. From the previous chapter, we learned that it is somehow impossible for country to survive on its own. Therefore, country needs to connect to other countries for better survival and better development of the economy. Let's step further to discuss the importance or the significance of trade for Australia's economy. We could summarize and wrap up those importance of trade into these five different areas. Firstly, trade is important for country to allocate resources efficiently. Next, trade also allows countries to have wider consumer choices for goods and services. International trade allows countries to have healthy competition that prevent monopolies in the domestic market. Finally, undoubtedly, international trade could help to improve economic growth of countries. Due to limited resources and unlimited wants and desire, it is impossible that countries produce whatever they want and whatever they need for consumption. However, international trade allow countries to expand their consumption possibility through trading, meaning that countries could import from other countries the products or the services that they are not able to produce domestically, or it is too expensive for them to produce domestically. In other words, through international trade, countries just to concentrate on producing what they could specialize in order to save the resources. And this is what we call it as efficient allocation of resources and specialization. If all countries concentrate on producing what they could produce the best at the lowest opportunity cost, this would help the whole world to increase the world's output. Because specialization allows bigger scales of production, therefore, the unit cost of production falls and countries achieve economies of scale. International trade, in particular importing, allow countries' households to enjoy wider consumer choices of goods and services, especially for those goods and services that they cannot produce domestically or it is too expensive for them to produce by themselves. So, from the imported goods and services, consumers, and households they gained greater satisfaction and improved their standard of living. International trade, especially import, increases competitions and prevents monopolies. In order to compete with foreign competitors, domestic producers they have to strive hard to improve their quality and their innovation, and this also help to put downward pressure on the price of goods and services in the country. Exporting allows countries to expand their market share at the global marketplace because export allows firms, domestic producers, to produce for a world market rather than just small domestic market. This help to increase GDP of a nation and also improve the efficiency of the country. Besides international trade through import and export, countries are able to exchange and transfer technologies which help to improve innovation and productivity of countries. In short, we could conclude that international trade stimulates economic growth of nations. Free trade allows countries to experience mutual gain. Gains from import and export can be explained by opportunity cost-based theory. Before we move further, we must understand what is opportunity cost. It is actually those potential benefits that missed out when countries choose one alternative over another. The theory assumes that there are only two countries in this world and only two goods produced by these countries. Two types of advantage gained by countries from international trade. Absolute advantage is when the country produces a good or service more efficiently than another country. From the example in this PPF, the production possibility frontier, it is observed that Australia has absolute advantage to produce lamb, while China has the absolute advantage to produce cloth. But this is not always the case. Sometimes certain country might have absolute advantage to produce both the products. On the other hand, comparative advantage explains that a country could produce a good or service with the lowest opportunity cost as compared to the other country. When the country could produce a product at lowest opportunity cost, the country gains comparative advantage, which would increase the nation's output and achieve economies of scale. So, from where country could gain comparative advantage? The sources of comparative advantage include resource endowment, which means the natural resources available in the country or the climate of the country. Secondly, wage cost and labor supply of the country also allow country to gain comparative advantage in producing certain good or service. Higher labor productivity and low wage costs allow country to produce a good or service at lower opportunity cost. Next, the source of comparative advantage is also the ability of country to gain economies of scale. These include the ability to utilize technological change, the ability to manage the managerial processes to ensure efficiency of labor and capital. Investment in research and development (R&D) also allow countries to produce more efficiently because R&D can drive innovation and invention. Exchange rate of a country would affect the price of import and export and therefore affecting the demand for the import and export as well. We have learned the concept of comparative advantage, and in fact, we could demonstrate comparative advantage through the mathematical calculation. Assuming the two countries in this world are USA and South Korea, and the two products that produced by these countries are Apple and smartphone. To calculate comparative advantage, the first step is to calculate opportunity cost to produce both products of both countries, meaning that we have to repeat the calculation for four times. One calculation for Apple for USA, one calculation for smartphone for USA, and we repeat the calculation for opportunity cost for South Korea's Apple and South Korea's smartphone. Based on calculation, we found that the opportunity cost to produce one Apple in USA equals 0.33 smartphone, whereas for South Korea, to produce one Apple, it costs South Korea zero point 0.5 smartphone. So, the opportunity cost of producing Apple is lower in USA than in South Korea. Therefore, we conclude that USA has comparative advantage in production of Apple. So, from the calculation, we found that South Korea have lower opportunity cost to produce smartphone. Therefore, South Korea has the comparative advantage as compared to USA in producing smartphone. In this case, USA would produce Apple in order to gain comparative advantage, while South Korea would produce smartphone to gain comparative advantage. And USA would sell surplus of Apple to South Korea in order to exchange for smartphone. And on the other hand, South Korea would sell surplus of smartphone they produce to USA to exchange for Apple, which they don't produce. But at what price the countries would trade? This price, we call it as terms of trade, TOT, the rate at which goods are exchanged. The calculation for TOT is to add up the opportunity cost of each product and divide by 2. Based on calculation, the best rate to change for one Apple is 0.415 smartphone, but to change one smartphone, the best rate is 2.5 Apple. Of course, it is not necessary that country must follow this fixed rate. Instead, they could use a range to allow them to exchange the goods. The range of TOT is by using the highest and the lowest opportunity costs for each product. Besides using calculation, we could also use the demand and supply model to demonstrate gains from trade. This is one of the most popular questions for this topic in the WAIS exam. To answer this question in exam, there are 7 things that you must know. These include to draw an export graph or import graph. Number third, from the graph, you must be able to identify the quantity for import and quantity for export. And then to identify the world price. Next, to find out where is the consumer surplus or the gains for the consumer and the gains for the producers. And lastly, we must be able to identify from the graph where is the gains from trade. To identify the gains from trade, we must know how to find the consumer surplus and producer surplus. Well, before trade, a country within the domestic market, it is a win-win situation for the consumer and the producers. However, after the country import or export, the consumer surplus and producer surplus change. A little trick to help yourself to understand better how to find or how to identify the consumer and the producer surplus is that to find the triangle for consumers and the triangle for producers. The vertical side of the triangles for both consumer and producers is the same, which is the price or the vertical axis. And the diagonal side of the triangle for consumer is actually the demand curve. You just need to bear in mind that consumer demand and producer supply. So meaning that the diagonal side for the producers is actually the supply curve. And the last side for their triangle is the price level. The price level is actually the world price line. So let's take a look at the gains from export graph. Do you still remember? For export graph, the world price must be above the PE, the domestic price. So we shift the price line upward. And you could see the producer surplus increase after export, whereas the surplus for consumers reduce. The triangle for consumer becomes smaller after trade. The producer surplus increase from AB to ABCDE, whereas the consumer surplus reduced from CDF to F. On the other hand, after import, the gains for consumers increase, whereas the producer surplus reduce. So that's the end of the part 1.